Hi, and thank you for tuning in today. My name is Seth Gerson, and I'm Program Director for K-12 Education here at the National Governors Association. Welcome to NGA's webinar on exploring strategies for supporting Native American students during and beyond the COVID-19 pandemic. Please note that this is the fourth in an ongoing Reflect and Redesign series of NGA webinars that will continue to explore lessons learned during the pandemic and elevate state and local exemplars that can inform gubernatorial efforts for improving the K-12 education system during and beyond COVID. Please check out our earlier webinars on state education budgeting, re-engaging students, and summer learning and enrichment on the NGA website. Forthcoming webinars will focus on addressing the unique needs of students with disabilities, English learners, and students experiencing homelessness, as well as strategies for engaging parents and families and supporting staff well-being. Today, I'm honored to engage in a conversation with a national expert in this area, Kara Bobroff. Kara is the founder of the Native American Community Academy, or NACA, and the NACA-Inspired Schools Network, which seeks to replicate and expand best practices for culturally relevant, rigorous academics, and the sharing and embedding of Indigenous values and perspectives in education at schools across multiple states, including in New Mexico. Kara is an educator by background and also previously served as Deputy Secretary of Education at the New Mexico Public Education Department under Governor Lujan Grisham. Kara, welcome. Great to have you with us today. Before we dive into specific questions, please take a few minutes to tell us about how you came to this work and your personal connection to it.
Yeah, thank you, Seth. Thank you for that introduction. So I just want to introduce myself. Yate Hairbarra, Finishe, Ashin Ashlin, Natani Bashchin. So good morning or afternoon, whenever you are have an opportunity to engage in this. And I am just really excited to be able to share a little bit about our experience, both from the standpoint of NACA-Inspired Schools Network, and then also some work we're doing in philanthropic communities, and the experience that I had at the state level as well. But my personal connection is I'm Navajo on my mom's side. Was born in the Saul clan in a community. My biological family is from Rama, which is right outside of Albuquerque, and part of the Navajo Nation. Born for Lakota, which is from the Pine Ridge area. I was raised in Albuquerque, New Mexico, by two educators. Both my father and my mother were middle school educators, and my father went on to be a school and district administrator. So really have had public education in our family, and also I'd say in my blood as well, as that goes. I always kind of knew that being a Native student in a large urban system, there was a lack of, cultural connection, curriculum, role models, and support, kind of throughout the time since I was in first grade all the way through high school. And it wasn't really until college that I had the opportunity to really engage in learning things around Native American literature, history and government, which really inspired me to think about at one point, to serve in my community and in Native American education. I started as a special education teacher and spent several years teaching in the school that I went to. Started to kind of see what equity looked like and inequities looked like, and who had access to certain types of learning and who didn't. Went on to become an assistant principal and principal in my home school district, which was Albuquerque Public Schools, and then moved to the Bay Area and worked as a dean of students up in Marin County, just north of the Bay Area. Also kind of seeing what students had access to in their public education experience, which was really much different than what our students had in New Mexico and myself. And started to really try to think about what could we do to provide a school that had that kind of responsiveness to students and families, as well as that rigor and focus on college education for all students back home. Spent 2 years on the Navajo Nation as a principal, and really saw the vibrancy and strengths of language and culture in a community that was really dedicated to their students, and also saw a disconnect again in how we really leverage those strengths. All of those things combined with my personal and professional relationship led me to start the Native American Community Academy in 2005. It was a collaborative charter school with Albuquerque Public Schools, and has grown into a national exemplar for how we think about community-led education and Indigenous education. It serves about 62 different tribes, 14 different ethnicities. Out of that, we had many requests from both local communities as well as communities across the country around how do we start a NACA, and it was you don't want to start a NACA, you want to like engage your community to create a school that meets the needs of your students. And so we started a fellowship program in 2014, which is now 7 years old. And we have schools that have kind of come to fruition in New Mexico, Colorado. We have another school that will be opening in California, as well as South Dakota and up in Red Lake most recently, and then some sister schools in Oklahoma. So this work is really near and dear to so many people's hearts. And I feel like, you know, states play an important role in encouraging serving Native students in a way that makes sense for the communities in which they reside. So that's a little bit about that. And then currently, I took a sabbatical and I had an opportunity to serve at the public education department to think about how to serve Native students and others through a culturally responsive lens. And right now I'm leading an organization called One Generation. And our goal is to further Indigenous education and also create the right, I want to say like ecosystem, both locally and nationally, that will inspire new solutions that promote Native American communities in ways that they see they need to address like some things that they want to see for themselves through innovation and also through excellence and relevance. So that's a lot, but I'm excited to have this conversation and looking forward to it.
Thanks, Kara. Really appreciate you giving your background and how the different lenses that you bring to the work over your career. And one of the pieces you mentioned was around the inequities you saw among students in education, and maybe we can start there. One of the efforts that governors have undertaken was to address the digital divide during the time of COVID, the gaps and inequities for access to devices and connectivity and internet access for students, educators, and families. What have you seen as some of the challenges for Native American students who engaged in remote or hybrid learning during school building closures? And what are some of the strategies or recommendations you see for improving connectivity and digital literacy for those students and families?
Yeah, so with my home, think about one of my home communities and some of the schools that we supported out on the Navajo Nation, in other areas as well, both in South Dakota. As like we started to see the need to go to remote learning, it was really clear that there wasn't the ability to provide broadband access to some communities just because of where they're physically located. Like it was literally impossible because service providers weren't available to even begin to tap into. Others is just like a lack of infrastructure and being able to access internet in the home. And so many of the families weren't able to do that either. And then also devices. So when you think about those three things kind of coming together all at one time, when the push is really like we're going to a remote learning stance, there's a lot of things the starting place is very, very different versus a student like in Albuquerque who was like maybe at NACA who may just needed a device. So your starting point is very, very different in that situation. Some things that we saw is that, you know, how districts and the state respond in conjunction with one another is really, really important. And also working with tribal education departments. I think that, you know, states have a specific role through their public education department, but we also realize that the Bureau of Indian Education and also local tribes and or pueblos and or nations, depending on your state and the tribes that reside in it, also have tribal departments of education. So we really work to leverage all three of those things and being in constant communication with school districts about how they were disseminating resources to students, as well as thinking about access to broadband, as well as tribal education departments. They're often working with students on a one-to-one basis and supporting those kids who are attending regular like public school districts as well. And then charter schools who may not fit into a school district, but are serving a really unique mission and also experience a lot of inequities from the starting block as well around facilities and infrastructure and finance. And really being proactive and reaching out to those entities and understanding like what are the specific things that they need and how can a state agency or division of education begin to start to address some of those and not being hesitant to do so. You know, a couple of examples is that we were able to disseminate not only devices, but wireless access points and working with a team that had been previously working on broadband issues, kind of at a regular pace that you would see, not in the middle of a crisis, But that was really important that you already had somebody who had like a special eye on serving Native communities. I know now that, we're on kind of on the, and I don't know where we are, it's not the other end of it, but we're definitely like in and have learned a lot since. But having those things set up proactively was really, really helpful. The other thing is being able to like have the flexibility of resources to be able to direct them in a way that was immediate. Was also very, very helpful to be able to do that. And then being able to reach out to families, grandparents, and parents. I think of a story a principal friend of mine shared with me was that, she was having a conversation with a grandmother, and she's like, I am taking care of my grandkids, and, we're dealing with a health issue. We're also, dealing with issues around like their parents having to work, and I'm the primary, person at home, and I have 6 different kids that I'm working with, and we don't have the, materials we need, but also if you show me what you need me to do, I can do that. So being able to have people who can work not just in the middle of the like response mode, but ongoing with families around how to utilize technology in the home and how do you access that. I think that was really, really helpful as well. And then I think last thing is like not necessarily seeing it just as getting these things to people, but how is your state agency uplifting education in a way that you have a strong focus on education in the area of technology. So ed tech, nonprofits across the nation could be very, very helpful in that space. But do you have the right standards in place? Are students able to understand how to utilize technology in a way that enhances their learning? And how can they access resources that doesn't necessarily like tie them down when there's not a teacher in front of them? And give them more autonomy to be able to learn in a way that's much more flexible. So I think those are all things that kind of come to mind when I think of Native communities. And also realizing that there needs to be coordination between the Bureau of Indian Education and also tribal education departments. And if it's a crisis mode like we were in, I would say that would be on a weekly basis. But if not, it could be biweekly. And even maybe, best practice would be to create a cohesive plan together around how you might approach broadband planning. And that came like down to like school to school, like you can like set up something at a chapter house or community center, different things like that. Like what are the resources within that community? And usually all of those folks are working together in some way, but a state can be huge in convening folks with a specific intent on creating that kind of plan that intersects with each agency and each entity.
Thanks, Kara. Really helpful. And I think you're really speaking to the importance of the cross-agency work and the coordination of among the state level of not only thinking about the State Department of Education, but the Tribal Department of Education, the BIE schools, and then how do you outreach to parents and families on the ground to make sure that they're aware of the work and sort of the different devices and connectivity and access that's available to them that hopefully then spurs continued action and sustains those efforts over time. And I think it's also an important point. We saw this a number of different states of really working out to your different tech providers that are operating in the state to fill some of those gaps, those public-private partnerships that not only government can do, but engaging your business leaders, your business community to help fill some of those gaps. So thank you for those important points. We've seen, because of that large scale move to remote learning, some of which some schools are still in, depending on the impact that's been disproportionately felt, we've seen some of the amplified unfinished learning and learning gaps for students as a result of the pandemic. What do those gaps look like for Native American students, and what recommendations would you have for academic recovery during this time and going beyond even COVID? And do you see summer as a good opportunity for leveraging some of that change?
Yeah, I feel like, when we think about serving Native students, any kind of year-round approach is going to be really, really positive. And the reason why I believe is that, students, if they're in a tribal and or rural area, the school's the hub of where they, see one another, where they're able to connect, even in remote learning kind of stance, and also where you can really like enrich a child's learning. So I feel like a year-round approach should be one that's in place regardless, and whether like the K-12 primary, school district is that provider the whole time is like, a question, but also like who else in that community can really help with providing opportunities to learn for Native students. And so I think of things like, the Boys and Girls Club, or is it, a entity that can provide tutoring and or mentoring? Is there a Department of Health or a youth, Native youth office that's provided by the tribe themselves? There's so many different other programs and providers in the nonprofit sector, and also within tribal departments of education, tribal youth programs, tribal health programs, through the Indian Health Services, that can be mapped out so that students have access to be engaged throughout the entire year, both in summer and after school. Some of the things that we've seen, students coming back and having, my nephew is really, he and I were having a conversation. He's teaching at my school that we started, and he went there, he graduated as well and went on to college and is now back. But he said, it's really clear to me that students have returned, and he's a high school, middle school teacher, have come back with an idea around like, what is the purpose of school? And so I think like defining that with students and families in this moment is really, really important as well. And then also not constraining kids in the sense of like slowing down their ability to be autonomous in their learning. We see like gaps in, areas of literacy, mathematics, thinking about, what content, what path were you on as far as like maybe matriculating to college, where do those things fit in, and being able to address those in a way that makes sense. That's not a one size fits all for kids is really, really important. So more and more differentiation, and then also utilizing, I know we'll get to this later on a little bit, but how are we utilizing our federal funding and or state resources to be able to build out solutions that make sense in this moment in time that could sustain as well. And so I know, think about Native students have always had kind of this opportunity gap that they are trying to fulfill, and that just got deepened even more so during the pandemic. So I feel like there's always a need, and so we shouldn't build just for this moment or just for a minute, but really build something that's going to be sustained over time. And it seems like to me that so many people are aware of that, and so many other organizations are as well. It's like bringing folks together to be able to do that, whether that's, bringing in a core of like tutors, whether that's bringing in a core that's looking at mentorship and like reconnection for students, and also asking students like, what do you need and where do you want to be, and setting like really concrete goals at an individual student level as well as a school community. Families will also share kind of like, how they're feeling, like their concerns and their hopes and opportunities around like, what can we do together? And then being able to co-create that, I think, is really, really important, and doing it in a holistic manner and not disconnecting students' intellectual, whole wellness from their social emotional wellness, their connection to their community, and then also their physical health and wellness as well.
Thanks, Kara. Yeah, I remember we've had so many discussions, prior to the pandemic around student engagement and voice, and certainly seeing that more amplified now, and a more interest in engaging that voice and choice. I think, with the move to remote, teachers feeling like there was more of an ability to even do so and to differentiate, and so how to harness that as we go back to in-person learning, and ensuring that student voice and engagement is there. I think you're right, is critically important. And you mentioned holistic needs, something we've seen across the board, not just for Native American students, but the holistic and mental health needs right now, because of the resulting pandemic, the fear, anxiety, and stress that students felt during the pandemic. And we know, again, disproportionately impacted Native American communities during this time. So how have you seen schools re-engage Native American students as they return to the classroom, and how are these schools using strategies to engage parents and families and communities in doing so?
Yeah, I think a return to kind of understanding that Native communities have a strong tie to different, I guess, like, how can I put this? I want to say traditions and a strong core value of kinship and relationship. And in Navajo, the terminology is K-E, which is basically that we know that we have this interconnection and we're all related in some way. And I feel like starting with that cultural value set can be something that a school or a school system can be really responsive to. And I think that once you ground both the students, families, the school community, whether it's a school district that probably serves Native American students, and or even the state entity, just acknowledging that's a really big step to take. Once that kind of commonality is established, it gives good grounding and a sense of connection that people are with one another and supporting one another. And that is really, really important. And it just like shifts the feeling that it's not just about an institution that's like here disconnected from the community's culture, but it's really an institution that respects the community's culture. So I think first and foremost, that's that. I think that also asking students like, how does your community come together has been a great way to have like reentry into the school community. And I also have seen that where you're able to kind of adjust how, if you're not able to bring people together to meet in person in large gatherings, but how can you do that in a small gathering? What are those like little different efforts that you can make to engage families along the way? And that's been helpful. I know, our school had to have our annual feast day on in a remote setting on Facebook, and it was fine, but like parents appreciated that and students still prepared for it. And so there's these tiny steps that can be taken to be able to keep that connection and relationships together. I think the other thing is like thinking about holistic wellness and bringing together staff members and students in an intentional way to reflect upon their own wellness and development, and how are they feeling and how are they functioning? What are the things that they need to be able to really start to work with them as individuals and also collectively. So, having advisors in school, making contact with parents. I know that there was a lot of responsiveness where the relationship between the teacher and the parent changed dramatically during remote learning. But how do you continue to have that solid relationship now that some schools are back in session? And how do you grow those relationships even more so, not just because there's, this moment of crisis, but how do we utilize that same kind of connection going forward? So I think that's the relational piece. And then other entities, again, that can provide support for students who may need access to, counseling or social work. And one of the other kind of related items that has come up is that there was a response around schools providing food for families during this time. And that, has shifted. But I was reading, there's a report, I think, that came out in Colorado recently, and I can send it to you, Seth, once I get my hands on it, that said that even though families had this response to, providers being able to provide food for families during this time, it's still going to take 8 years for us to recover in this area around accessing food and stability in providing families that kind of care. So I think those are some things to think about, is like, there was this moment in time, we responded, we strengthened some of the things, whether it was relational or like how we interact or disseminate resources. And that's not necessarily like what happened is going to have a ripple effect. And that ripple effect's probably going to take longer than what most of us are thinking is going to be remedied. So for planning for the long term, with what we did really, really well.
Thanks, Kara. And I really like that you brought the idea of kinship into the conversation, because, as we know, everything in education centers on relationships. And so building that trust and relationship with parents and families and students, I think you're exactly right. That's where, it starts. And even as we were talking about the academic needs, making sure that we're attending to those holistic mental health needs to begin with, so that students are more able to take in content, because that'll come, but starting the conversation in that way of trust and relationships. And I think one of the things we've talked about as parents and families and students, on the educator side, we've seen across the country staffing shortages. How has this impacted on the educator side, Native American students, the shortages among teachers, and do you have any recommendations on how to address those needs at this time for those communities?
Yeah, there's definitely a shortage of like different areas of expertise, which has always been true in some communities, right? In rural communities, tribal communities. It's been precedent's just been compounded by the pandemic. You know, I think there's a couple different things. One, I was thinking of alternative pathways to teacher certification. And I think that, you know, we always talk about like the teacher pipeline and what's a traditional pipeline through maybe a, you know, university program. There's other entities like Teach for America, or alternative licensure programs that are intentionally, you know, trying to you know, have folks come into the teaching profession. And I think, you know, our educational assistants. And so there was one example of, you know, entities providing funding to, you know, paraprofessionals or community members who serve in schools already and are really naturally gifted and able to serve in classrooms, and with the hope that they would then in turn, you know, pursue their degree and also get certified. And I feel like that is like kind of putting more emphasis on a system that's not working versus redesigning the system to work. So what I mean by that is that if we have these folks in our community and we know that they are able to serve in schools and we want to recruit them into the profession, but we want them to go through the same system that has not worked for them, we're not going to get the results that we need. So, you know, is there a way to use micro-credentialing or, you know, an outcomes-based assessment where principals and superintendents can invite in a cohort of aspiring teachers to receive, like, you know, real-time supports in classrooms and schools over 2 years, and then sign off that, yes, they can function as a, you know, certified teacher with or without, you know, the other aspects of what you might see in a traditional certification program. There's been some headway around that with the Indian Education Act in New Mexico, where, you know, tribes can certify their teachers to teach language and culture. You know, I think, like, could districts create a certification program that may not be like something you would see in a university, but they can highlight those folks that they know can become strong teachers. So that's one thing. I think also rethinking schools in general. You know, I know that there's some interesting work coming out of the University of Arizona where it's like, how do you have teams come together, redesigning the time that students are engaged with a team, and not necessarily saying you have to have one teacher for every 30 students in this kind of structure, but you're bringing together maybe some community members or out of school time providers, you know, a couple certified teachers who come through a traditional certification program, you know, some community advisors who are like really, you know, talented in providing expertise. Maybe it's in the area of computer science, maybe it's in the area of natural language, whatever those things are. And that's a team that's going to work with a group of students over a period of time, and they're going to develop their own approach to how they're going to work with those students. So being able to provide those flexibilities, both on the pathway, but also on what delivery looks like for schools and school districts, would be really, really helpful. And thinking about not necessarily being tied to having the school be this, like, you know, industrial model. And we've had these conversations for, I don't know how long, right? Is the school just the hub? And are there other ways to create ecosystems that are centered on learners versus centered on this like brick and mortar kind of concept of, like, you know, 8 to 5, and you go through a series of classes, and then at the end of that series of classes, you get your, you know, your high school diploma or, you know, your credit for that. But like, what are things that can be completely, like, how can you incentivize as a state and provide flexibility for learner-centered education to take place, where you're actually developing ecosystems of learning, providing the funding, bringing together educators and others to work with families to really create that. I think there's something I read, I don't know if it was when it was recently, about how many students ended up coming out of the traditional public education system. You know, it was in the millions across the country. And some of those folks went into charter schools, some went into different types of learning, some created, like, you know, pods on their own. But how do we support those kind of innovations? And also, how do we think about education just generally different, in a different mindset?
I think that's exactly right. Not just the egg crate model, but really, you know, really thinking differently about the entire system of how we bring, you know, teachers in, from the recruitment to the preparation to their entry, and how we have leadership positions for them to then teach that next generation of teachers and bring them along the whole professional
Yeah.
learning aspect of
Mhm.
the profession, and not just sticking with
Yeah.
tinkering around the edges, but you know, trying to make whole scale changes that we've talked about for a
Yeah.
number of years. And you know, that leads me to just ask you around that federal funding piece of that. We've seen sort of unprecedented federal funding for education over the last year or two, some of which can be used to address these changes. What would you prioritize as part of that funding, depending on your state context, and what are you most excited about sort of going forward?
Yeah, I think for me, I think it's those districts and schools and travel education departments and different entities who are really rethinking everything. And there's not, I would say like it's probably a smaller percent that are, because there is a demand to kind of get school back up and running, and those things can be at odds, but it's not impossible to do. So re-engaging your district and your school with school design and working with your community to think about what are the values and interests, like what are things that we've learned and what do we want to see different in creating that structure. So I think that intentional efforts around that, with an eye on racial equity, and using equity as a tool to think about like what were the inequities we've experienced, how do we start to address those, and how do we know that we could do things very, very differently in that moment, and how can we like leverage like that kind of innovation and responsiveness and collaboration together to think about how can we do things better now. So that's one thing. I think the other is that, utilizing some pilots and also getting some innovation going through smaller kind of, smaller attempts within your own school district, and thinking about, could we launch a hybrid model like that's going to be here all the time, right? So what does that look like for students? Can students opt into different opportunities that may not have been in existence before, that aren't only remedial? I think that there's this notion like, okay, we had a lot of like time that was lost as far as instructional time, but how do we like enrich what students are experiencing? I think that's equally important, and also provide like meaningful learning for kids in this moment. I think about the gifted kid who's sitting in class like, man, if we were in remote, I would have like done all my work and I would have been reading another book and like drawing something and doing this. And like, I'm still gonna get an A, like whether I'm like in a remote setting or I'm in the class, but man, I really like to be doing my own thing too. Thinking about students who are also thinking about like, well, why do we have to be like in this setting every single day, all day long? Can I also have an internship, or can I also like help my family? And so I think those are some great questions to think about co-design and co-collaboration around like what things might look different. What I would prioritize is being able to have those conversations, and also setting really specific like deadlines around like, okay, in the first 6 months, we're going to engage our communities in asking these questions about what do we want to see different, and then start planning for the following school year to be able to make those big shifts and changes. Succession planning. I know we talked a lot about the teacher pipeline, but equally around school leadership. We're not there. There's also kind of a shortage of principals and systems leaders, and thinking about how does a district and or partner with a higher education entity or a tribe or a tribal department of education or a tribal college to start developing really intentional fellowships and bringing people into the school setting who can take on these roles in a year or two. And then also bringing back to education those folks who have gone to either into retirement or have stopped out for whatever reason, and really encouraging them to come back and have a role around coaching or mentorship or experience. And I think that to me, could be like very simple to do in the next 3 to 5 years, given the timeline of the ARPA funds that are coming out. I would say the other thing that's really specific to Native American communities is Indigenous languages. And we just recently provided some policy recommendations at a federal level around how can you start to think about communities in a way that revives Indigenous languages, and knowing that, we started with 300, since time immemorial. Now we're I think roughly around 160 that are intact in various status, different levels from vulnerable to almost endangered. And then it's projected by 2050 that we may only have 22 different languages in place. And so, I know that that is a huge issue. And so not losing sight of that, but using some of these recovery funds to really bolster that up, both in increasing the number of speakers that are in communities and also training teachers as well, and setting up different types of programs, whether it's community-based immersion programs, and also thinking about your bilingual education models and how that might be something that you can enhance and better support this effort to be able to do that. I think that's a huge area as well. So those are all a lot of different things that can take place, but it's an opportunity that would be missed if we kind of go back to the status quo of like, we're going right back into the same system that we had. I don't think that that would be something that would be serving folks well in this moment or time.
Thanks, Kara. And
Yeah.
I think, your point about just starting with co-creating that vision with students and parents and teachers and families, because those needs may be different among communities, but making sure that you're bringing them in early and that it's a completely bought in sort of vision as you're going forward in the process, and thinking about educators as not just teachers, but the principal pipelines that need to take place, and then making sure that your cultural responsiveness and your attention to language and literacy is expansive and bringing in those communities to do so. So really appreciate the conversation today, your insights, and listeners on the line. Any resources we discussed today will be attached to the webinar when we release it, and it'll be posted on the NGA website in the coming weeks. So until next time, we thank you for listening. We hope you and your family stay safe and well, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks.
Thank you.